There's a generation that nobody really talks about, not because they're boring, not because they have nothing to say, but because they were raised to handle things quietly, figure it out themselves, and never make it anyone else's problem. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, this video is for you. And if you've ever felt like you exist somewhere between two worlds, too young to be a boomer, too old to be a millennial, like you somehow got skipped in every cultural conversation, that feeling has a name. And it goes a lot deeper than you might think. Society has a word for how your generation was raised: feral. And honestly, that word isn't wrong. You grew up in a time when kids disappeared after breakfast and came home when the streetlights turned on. No GPS, no check-ins, no one tracking your every move. You were handed a house key, maybe at age 8 or 9, and that was it. That was the whole safety plan. Psychologists now look back at that era and see something remarkable. Not neglect, but an accidental experiment in human resilience. A generation that was quietly forged by independence, uncertainty, and the kind of freedom that no longer exists. But here's what most people miss. The way you were raised didn't just shape your childhood. It rewired your brain. It built a psychological architecture that's completely different from every generation that came before or after you. And in this video, we're going to break down exactly what that means. The traits, the patterns, the quiet strengths, and yes, the hidden costs of growing up the way you did. By the end, a lot of things about yourself are going to make a lot more sense. To understand Generation X, you have to understand the world they were born into. The 1960s and 70s were a time of massive social upheaval. The traditional family structure was cracking. Divorce rates were climbing steadily through the 70s and into the 80s, nearly doubling compared to the previous generation. Both parents were entering the workforce in record numbers, and somewhere in the middle of all that change, the children of Gen X were left to navigate life largely on their own. Researchers have a term for this: the latchkey generation. By 1984, an estimated 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. 7 million kids coming home to an empty house, letting themselves in, making their own snacks, doing their own homework, and waiting. That waiting shaped something deep. Developmental psychologists talk about something called the internal locus of control, the belief that your outcomes depend on your own actions, not on luck, not on other people, not on the system. Most children develop this gradually, with guidance. Gen X developed it out of necessity, because there was no one else to rely on, and the environment outside wasn't much softer. Cold War anxiety was woven into everyday life. Duck and cover drills in school. News anchors talking about nuclear threats like they were weather forecasts. Adults telling children not to worry, while clearly worrying themselves. That contradiction, that gap between what adults said and what was actually happening, taught Gen X something early. The official story isn't always the real story. What emerged from all of this wasn't a broken generation. It was something more interesting. A generation with a finely tuned psychological immune system. Resilient, skeptical, self-sufficient, and carrying a quiet complexity that most people never fully see. That's what we're going to explore. Let's start with the first one. The armor of realistic thinking. Gen X doesn't do blind optimism. And that's not a flaw, it's a feature. Psychologists call it defensive pessimism. It's a cognitive strategy where you mentally prepare for things to go wrong. Not because you're negative, but because experience taught you the rug can get pulled out at any moment. You watched people work hard, follow the rules, and still get laid off. You watched institutions promise stability and deliver chaos. So you adapted. You stopped expecting the fairy tale and started planning for reality. People read this as cynicism. But it's actually emotional intelligence, protecting yourself from the kind of disappointment that comes from believing too easily. In a world full of people chasing hype, that grounded realism is one of the rarest traits in any room. The quiet competence. Gen X doesn't talk about what they're doing. They just do it. No LinkedIn post about the project they just saved. No announcement about the overtime they put in. They show up, handle it, and move on. When you grow up in an environment where no one is watching to give you credit, you stop performing for an audience. You start performing for results. Psychologists call this intrinsic motivation, doing something because it matters, not because someone is watching. The real-life version is the Gen X manager who quietly fixes the crisis before anyone else knew there was one. The colleague who's been holding the team together for years without a single award. They don't need the recognition, but they deserve it. The hyper-independence paradox. Here's where it gets complicated. Gen X is fiercely independent. But that independence didn't come from confidence. It came from necessity. When you spend years learning that asking for help leads to disappointment, vulnerability starts to feel dangerous. Relying on others starts to feel like a risk you can't afford. Research in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during stress, not because they have no one to ask, but because asking feels like admitting defeat. The reframe: hyper-independence isn't strength. It's a survival strategy that outlived the situation that created it. Recognizing that is the first step to something healthier. The bridge nobody notices. Gen X is the only living generation fully fluent in two completely different worlds. They remember life before the internet, the weight of a library card, waiting for a song on the radio, the way information had a physical cost. And they also built the digital world everyone else now lives inside. They're not digital natives. They're digital immigrants who learned the language so well that most people forgot they weren't born speaking it. They translate between the boomers who resist change and the younger generations who've never known anything else. They're the bridge, but bridges don't get much attention. They're just there, holding things together, doing the work, expecting nothing in return. And if you're Gen X, you already knew that. Here's what all of this adds up to. Generation X didn't get a soft landing. They got an empty house, a key around their neck, and a world that expected them to figure it out. And they did, quietly, without making it anyone's problem. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. The feral label was never an insult. It was a description of something rare, a generation raised with enough freedom to develop real resilience, real judgment, and a kind of inner steadiness that can't be taught in a classroom or downloaded from an app. You learned early that the world doesn't owe you comfort, and somehow that made you more capable of finding it on your own terms. So if you've spent years feeling like you exist in the background, overlooked, underestimated, quietly holding things together while everyone else gets the spotlight, this is your reminder. The bridge is the most important part of the structure. It just doesn't get the view. And you were built for exactly this.